Today on the Playbook Podcast, a look at a trendy new group of swing voters, what Pete Buttigieg told me about the 2024 presidential race, and Jimmy Kimmel's removal from air ignites a new free speech debate. Hello, I'm Adam Wren.
And I'm Myah Ward. It's Friday, September 19th.
And this is the Playbook Podcast. And as you can hear, we are so lucky, and I have the pleasure of welcoming White House reporter Myah Ward back to the podcast this morning. Myah, thanks so much for being here.
Good to be back.
Without further ado, let's get right to what's driving the day. There's a new group of swing voters to watch ahead of next year's midterms. And instead of just watching their kids' soccer games, Myah, they are wearing weighted vests. Myah, have you seen weighted vests in your Instagram or TikTok feeds?
Yes. First off, I'm obsessed that you're covering this. Yes, my algorithm has consistently targeted me with the weighted vest videos, and they'll be walking with their weighted vests and coffees and talking about how this is the way to increase your sweat and your gains. So yes, I am definitely getting all the weighted vest material.
Yeah, right before I got an exclusive look at this poll from the widely respected GOP pollster Christine Matthews, who has done work for former Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels and former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan. She is sort of vaunted for her ability to probe into women's insights about politics and culture. I had a conversation with my wife who told me that she really wanted to buy a weighted vest. And so when this poll came across my desk, I was eager to dig into the results. And what we're seeing, Myah, emerge here is there's a new group of swing voters to watch ahead of next year's midterms, and that's women who wear weighted vests. Essentially, this is the it fitness accessory of 2025. And there's sort of a political niche here. And Christine Matthews, who lives in Alexandria, she was seeing women wearing weighted vests everywhere she went. And she did some Googling and wanted to find out just how many women were wearing weighted vests, who they were, what their political views were. And so she commissioned her own poll. She's the president of Bellwether Research and put her own money towards this and essentially found out that in a poll of 1,000 women voters, 18 and older, that about 1 in 6 women voters wear weighted vests. Now, what does this have to do with politics in the midterms? Well, it turns out she's tracking a new cohort who could decide next year's midterms. And essentially, of the 1,000 people, and a caveat here, it's a large sample size, but a small cohort, there are about 90 women in this cohort who wear weighted vests. And it turns out that Donald Trump won by 3 points women who wear weighted vests in 2024. But now, as we enter into the midterms next year, this group is tied at 47 to 47% on a generic ballot between Republicans and Democrats. And Myah, these are people who get their news from social media. They're deeply plugged into the news. They trust their doctors. They're not necessarily Maha moms, although some Maha moms may also wear a weighted vest. They skew a little bit more conservative than you would expect, but they are considering Democrats in 2026 too. And so this is a cohort that Christine Matthews tells me she's going to be watching the next few months. What do you make of this, Myah? Do you see from your own lived experience any sort of correlations here? I mean, a lot of these people are suburban and urban dwellers who are pretty plugged in, a little bit more wealthier than the average median voter. So what do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'm obviously not in charge at Politico, but I think that you need to be on the weighted vest beat 2026, maybe through 2028.
Yeah.
But look, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we're talking about the suburbs, right? And I mean, Trump won by a few points in 2024, and they're going to be key swing areas again in 2026 and 2028, especially when you're talking about these women voters. And I was just thinking back to Harris in 2024 and really wanting to turn out the suburban women in a number of key swing states to push her to victory. But Trump ultimately performed better. And these voters are really concerned about the economy, inflation, cost of living. And we're also weighing these key issues of abortion and crime and democracy, another issue that Democrats were leaning into so heavily. And so Trump did better, but as we recall, his campaign did a ton to really focus and target these male voters, which ended up being a weakness for Democrats in a lot of ways. And so I think Republicans are going to really try to carry that forward with men, but they're going to have to put in this work with suburban women as well. And the Democrats are going to be grappling with these same questions. Abortion was one that ended up being incredibly crucial to 2022. What is that going to be in 2026? I think it's going to depend what is the state of the economy? Is that the issue that voters care the most about at the end of the day? Is it some revival of a democracy type of message? We're talking so much this week about free speech, and we're saying that that's kind of the issue of the week for Democrats. It's hard to know, but both parties are going to really be pushing for the way to best women.
That's right. And, I should say that this poll did definitely affirm the idea that Maha moms are real. We learned from this poll that Democratic women are more confident about vaccine safety than Republican and independent women. And only 24% of Republican women strongly agree that vaccines administered in the United States are generally safe, while 49% of Democratic women strongly agree with that. Also, we learned that more broadly, 31% of Gen Z women disagree that vaccines are, quote, generally safe, end quote. And they're turning to social media influencers, podcast, and self research over doctors and institutions for information. Myah, you've covered the MAGA movement and the Maha movement. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, this is really an interesting moment for Maha. And I think we're seeing the president in particular kind of walk that tightrope. I mean, for one, yesterday we saw the CDC's outside vaccine advisors. And just a reminder, this is a group handpicked by RFK Jr., voted yesterday to not recommend the MMRV vaccine to kids younger than 4, and also recommended that this vaccine be split into 2 groups. And then we have another vote today about the universal recommendation for the first hepatitis B vaccine given at birth and limit to the COVID vaccine. And so I think that this does raise the question of how does it play with these voters? Because Trump himself has signaled some discomfort with Kennedy's vaccine position. I mean, I was in the Oval a couple of weeks ago, and the president said, look, we need to be careful here because vaccines save lives. There's some really good ones. People want to be able to get them. And so it's an interesting question, like, is this group of voters that you're talking about going to be worried about this in 2026? Because they seem to be the contingent that could be a little bit uncomfortable with some of Kennedy's moves on vaccines, but also really supportive of this larger Maha push for healthier living and for companies to be held accountable and, better standards for what's in our food. And so the White House sees that part of what Kennedy stands for as incredibly popular. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, how do these two things work together and what wins out when people think about Maha?
Yeah. And another topic that I want to cover in this podcast today, you so expertly covered the Kamala Harris campaign in 2024. And it turns out we can't escape 2024. It's the only thing we're allowed to talk about. And it will be with us forever. It'll follow us into eternity. But just yesterday, the embargo on the former vice president's memoir, 107 Days, the length of her campaign lifted. And we were flooded with a ton of excerpts and nuggets from her book. And one of the ones that broke earlier in the week was her talking about how former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg was her number one choice for VP, but that she felt that he was too risky as a gay man, as vice president, running alongside a Black woman, and that they both sort of felt the sadness and recognition of this moment. Well, it turns out I had the chance to talk to Pete Buttigieg about this as he was campaigning in Indiana yesterday against a redistricting. And I essentially asked him what he made of this. And he said he was surprised. In the excerpt, Harris notes that she felt they mutually understood and were sad about the prospect that they couldn't campaign together because of America. And in addition to being surprised, he told me that, quote, my experience in politics has been that the way that you earn trust with voters is based mostly on what they think you're going to do for their lives, not on categories. Myah, what do you make of this memoir that I think, frankly, we can say pretty objectively that it surprised everybody in its tone and tenor and the way that it's gone after many of her potential 2028 Democratic rivals?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely sent shockwaves, right? I mean, especially knowing Harris as this politician who's very thoughtful about what she says and her actions. This is kind of Harris unleashed. And when I was reading your piece with Buttigieg's response, I had immediate flashbacks, just some of the reporting my colleagues and I did about Harris and her identity. And I think it's interesting. She was very subtle and strategic in this. I mean, I wrote a piece not long after she announced about how she was leaning into Kamala and the way that she knew that elevating her name mattered to constituents, both because it sent the signal that she's working for them. It was more informal, kind of conversational way to connect with young voters. But it also was this subtle nod to the fact that, Kamala, it carried weight for women, for communities of color to see that prominently displayed, especially when it was used as an attack on the right. But like I said, it was subtle. If she had won, she would have been making history. But Harris wasn't pointing that out. She was letting it speak for itself, not heavily promoting that she was the first Black woman, the first South Asian American person to lead a major party ticket. And that was this huge departure from what Hillary Clinton did as the first female Democratic presidential nominee. She heavily highlighted gender with the white pantsuits, the glass ceiling, the I'm with her slogan. So I guess this hyper awareness and even fear that she was expressing of this idea of her and Buttigieg on a ticket, Harris is now saying that out loud. I guess that part doesn't entirely surprise me.
Yeah, and as I was reading some of these excerpts, her Veep selection process sort of felt like the end of a Quentin Tarantino movie where loose ends are getting tied up, people are getting pummeled, and she doesn't really spare many of her potential 2028 rivals. Myah, is there any way that after an explosive memoir like this that she could mount a run in 2028?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to say because I think there are major questions about what are her ultimate intentions here and does she plan to run in 2028? But I think the question and what people are struggling with is, and you kind of got at this earlier, is like, how long are Democrats going to rehash 2024? And these same questions, how long are they going to haunt them? It just feels like we're still at a point, you know, months and months into Trump's first administration where they're talking more about 2024 than they are about, okay, what's that next message going to be as they try to sort through what that's going to be for 2026, what that's going to be for 2028.
Yeah, the 2024 books will continue until morale improves among Democrats. Finally, we're continuing to watch the fallout from Wednesday's announcement that Disney would pull Jimmy Kimmel Live from the air indefinitely. And FCC Chairman Brendan Carr is suggesting that the agency isn't stopping with Kimmel. Other late night hosts and programs like The View could feel the heat next. Myah, you have reported a lot in the wake of the Charlie Kirk shooting about how the White House and its allies wants to crack down on the left. What are you hearing and what are you seeing here as all this unfolds?
Yeah, I mean, we're just a little over a week after Kirk's death, and people are still warning the president is going to travel on Sunday for the memorial. Yet at the same time, it has really cracked open all of these major questions for the administration, how it's going to respond, for Democrats in this moment, for the country. And some of this action that we're seeing from the Trump administration, it's a continuation of what the president has been doing, this retribution tour, this crackdown on what the administration has said is this liberal media ecosystem. And with Trump, he says what he's thinking out loud. And, yesterday in the UK, he said this is not about speech, it's about lack of talent. And then he took that further later and said, maybe other networks should lose broadcast licenses if their on-air talent criticizes him. And that's the kind of rhetoric that we're already seeing Democrats seize on this week, saying that this is a threat to free speech. It's censorship. It's MAGA, engaging in the very thing they disdain, cancel culture. And, the White House is interesting. Some of the chatter among aides was making this point that this is different. This is not cancel culture. It's, as they were saying, it's consequence culture, and that there's a difference in the sort of progressive cancel culture that MAGA hates. And this is more about holding people accountable. And so I think it raises a few questions for me. And I know these are going to be important storylines that we're going to be following closely. Do Democrats latch onto this? Do they find that this is a resonant issue that they carry to 2026? I think on the Republican Party. Is this something that fractures parts of the party in any way? I was reporting this week about the administration's policy response to Kirk's death and Bondi's comments about hate speech. And, she obviously quickly cleaned those up, but I think it was an early sign and revealed that in response to this, that it's delicate and there's going to be such a thin line for this administration in its response. And it's very easy to go too far in the eyes of some Republican voters.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We saw the podcaster and comedian Tim Dillon come down on Trump for this, and also our colleague Elena Schneider, who smartly covered this issue. And we spoke to people like David Axelrod, who said that, look, Trump is an expert in getting Democrats to chase rabbits. And also, some rabbits, he said, need to be chased. And free speech is sort of a big issue here. And I talked to Pete Buttigieg about this yesterday as well, and he framed it as an issue of freedom and talked about people sort of being less free to speak their minds under Trump, which I thought was interesting. But this is certainly going to be an unfolding story for not just days, but weeks and potentially months. This is going to be a key tension, I think, that we're going to come back to again and again. And I had one source describe this to me yesterday as the quote, Orbanization of America, following Hungary's Viktor Orban in clamping down on any opposition media. And so I'm sort of fascinated to see where all this goes. Myah, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all for today's show, but we have much more news and analysis in today's Playbook newsletter, which you can find at politico.com/playbook. We'll be back Monday. Have a great day.